In Part 1 of the General Performance Principles Climb lesson, you learnt about the angle of climb, the best angle of climb speed, and lastly, about some of the factors that affect the climb, namely aircraft mass. In Part 2, you will continue the study of what factors affect the climb angle, starting with the effect of aircraft configuration.
The next factor that affects the climb angle is the configuration of the aircraft. By configuration we mean whether or not the flaps and undercarriage are deployed. If the undercarriage and flaps are deployed, then parasite drag will increase. More drag means that there is less excess thrust available. Notice now that the excess thrust is not able to balance all of the weight apparent drag. Therefore, the aeroplane's climb angle must be decreased to reduce the weight apparent drag to a value that can be balanced by the excess thrust. However, the effect of the gear and flaps on drag is a bit more complicated. Shown here is a graph representing induced drag, parasite drag, and the total drag. You may recall that deploying the undercarriage mainly increases parasite drag, and as a result, the parasite drag curve will move upwards. Notice, though, that the total drag curve has moved as well. In fact, it's moved slightly upwards and towards the left. It's important to understand and remember the fact that deploying gear and flaps moves the total drag curve up and left. Returning to the excess thrust graphs for the propeller and jet aeroplanes, it's now possible to see the effect of the movement of the total drag curve. Lowering the flaps and undercarriage moves the total drag curves up and to the left. Notice that, as we mentioned earlier, there is a decrease in the excess thrust available, and therefore a decrease in the maximum achievable climb angle. However, what is important to understand is that the speed at which maximum excess thrust is available is lower. Therefore, for both jet and propeller aeroplanes, as the gear and flaps are deployed, the speed for maximum angle of climb, Vx, will decrease. This means that although your climb angle will decrease with gear and flaps deployed, in order to get the best climb angle from this deteriorated performance situation, you will have to fly at a lower speed. It therefore seems prudent not to use flaps during the climb, so that the climb angle is as large as possible. But you may recall that flaps helped improve the overall takeoff performance. So, if you do use flap for takeoff, when it is safe to do so, remove the flap in stages. Consult your aircraft manual. The next factor that affects the climb angle is the density of the air. Density has a direct influence on the thrust produced by an engine. Decreasing density will reduce the amount of oxygen in the air available for combustion. Therefore, as density decreases, the thrust of both jet and propeller aeroplanes will decrease. Returning to the excess thrust graphs for the propeller and jet aeroplane, it's now possible to see the effect of decreasing density. Decreasing density will reduce the thrust, and therefore cause both thrust curves to move downwards. Notice that the excess thrust continually decreases, and therefore the angle of climb continually decreases. An important point to note is that Vx remains constant with changes in density. However, you will recall that when density decreased, true speeds increased. So, although the speed Vx is constant with decreasing density, the true airspeed for Vx will, of course, increase. The most notable and testable part of the effect of density on the angle of climb will be through altitude. As the altitude increases, density will decrease, and the angle of climb will steadily decrease. You'll recall from an earlier lesson that high ambient temperatures and high humidity both also decrease air density and decrease aeroplane performance. The second type of climb gradient is called the ground gradient. The ground gradient is calculated using the horizontal ground distance against the vertical distance. Unlike the air gradient, this time the start point of the ground gradient is fixed in relation to the ground. If there is a headwind, notice that the aircraft, relative to the previous path, is being pushed backwards and will cover a reduced horizontal ground distance. The result is that the climb angle increases. Therefore, headwinds will increase the ground gradient. Likewise, with a tailwind, the aircraft is being pushed forwards and will cover a far greater horizontal ground distance. The result is that the climb angle decreases. Tailwinds then will decrease the ground gradient. It's important to understand how headwinds and tailwinds affect the ground gradient, because ground gradients are used to calculate obstacle clearances. If there was an obstacle, like the one shown on screen, then if a tailwind were present, the aeroplane would not clear it. So, when making calculations to assess obstacle clearance performance, the climb gradient must be adjusted to take into account the effect of the wind. If we wish to manually correct the gradient for the effect of wind, the air gradient must be multiplied by a wind factor to obtain the ground gradient. When applying the wind factor, the formula we use is either true airspeed over true ground speed, or the true ground speed over the true airspeed. Determining which formula to use is relatively straightforward. Let's assume an air gradient of 12%, with a true airspeed of 100 knots and a headwind of 20 knots. This makes the true ground speed 80 knots, giving a wind factor of either 1.25 or 0.8. Determining which of the factors to use requires that you remember that headwinds increase the ground gradient. Therefore, the factor to use in this case is 1.25. Multiplying the air gradient of 12% by the factor 1.25 will give a ground gradient of 15%. If in the example we were given a tailwind, the air gradient would be multiplied by the wind factor, which would decrease the ground gradient. There is one additional complication. If the ground gradient is to be used for the calculation of obstacle clearances, the application of headwinds and tailwinds in the wind factor calculation must include the 50% headwind and 150% tailwind rules that you learnt about in the previous lesson. Returning to the example then, if the wind rules are applied, only 50% of the headwind should be used, meaning that only 10 knots rather than 20 knots should be used in the calculation of the ground speed. This makes the true ground speed 90 knots instead of 80 knots, and the resulting wind factors are 1.11 and 0.9. Again, because it's a headwind which will make the climb angle larger, the 1.11 wind factor must be used. This makes the ground gradient 13.3%. It's important that you understand when to use the 50% and 150% wind rules. In the case of climbing, use this rule whenever you have to calculate your obstacle clearance capability. In the previous scene, you learnt how to calculate the correct ground gradients for use in obstacle clearance problems. This part of the lesson will deal with those obstacle clearance problems. Firstly, let's examine a simple formula which puts this particular type of problem into perspective. The gradient is actually a ratio of the vertical and horizontal components of the climb expressed as a percentage. Shown on screen is the formula used to calculate the gradient. Rearranging the formula allows us to also calculate the horizontal and/or the vertical components. Now let's work through an example. Following a takeoff, a light twin-engine aeroplane climbs on a 10% climb gradient. By how much will it clear a 900 meters high obstacle situated at 10,000 meters from the 50-foot clearance point? In order to find out by how much the aeroplane will clear the obstacle, it's necessary to calculate the height the aeroplane will attain after covering a horizontal distance of 10,000 meters. Using the formula at the top left-hand side of the screen, you can see that to calculate the vertical component, the gradient must be multiplied by the horizontal component. This makes the equation 10% multiplied by 10,000 meters divided by 100. The answer is 1,000 meters. This means that the aeroplane will gain a height of 1,000 meters after covering a horizontal distance of 10,000 meters with a 10% climb gradient. However, the question stated that the aeroplane was at the end of the takeoff distance, and therefore at the screen height. In order to calculate the aeroplane's height above ground level, we must add the screen height, which is approximately 15 meters. We can now calculate the clearance. The aeroplane has attained a height of 1,015 meters above ground level, and the obstacle is 900 meters above ground level. Therefore, the clearance is 115 meters.